One of the things I learned from my time at Google is we're just scratching the surface of what the world needs for compute capacity and applications of compute capacity. We'll see evolutions of different product types, but I think there's going to be a lot of demand in a lot of different forms for the foreseeable future.
Hello and welcome to Cool Vector. I'm David Snow, your host. And today we're joined by Raj Vohra. He is head of data center investing for the Americas for Thor Equities, a major real estate investment firm with headquarters on 3 continents, $20 billion in assets under management, assets in all the major real estate food groups. Raj was head of data center acquisitions for the Americas for Google, which is a company that I've heard of. Raj, thanks so much for joining Cool Vector today. Great to have you here, and I'm looking forward to delving into what you know about data center investing.
Yeah, thanks, David. Looking forward to diving into it with you.
Excellent. Why don't we just start at a 1,000-foot level? How would you describe the Thor Equities strategy for data centers?
Yeah, essentially we're focused on real estate infrastructure development for hyperscale data centers in what I would call next up markets. Not necessarily called tier 2, tier 3. I don't like that language, but I really like to think about it as growth markets, things that are in the path of growth for large hyperscale development users. We're not necessarily focusing on the existing mega markets, great markets, but they're already tapped out. We do early stage land acquisition, power infrastructure enablement, some level of shell development. We've recently done retrofit where we bought into existing industrial facilities and helped develop that as a retrofit for a hyperscale user. We're primarily focused on that real estate infrastructure development component. We're not necessarily investing in existing companies or other companies.
Thor Equities is very well known in the real estate investment world. It's been around for a while. What did you see in Thor Equities as a promising place to continue investing in data centers?
Look, I spent a decade at Google. Great place to work still. Love my time there. But, for years, I could see the tidal wave coming, even pre-AI. And at some point, you got to make the decision. You want to be on the buy side or investor developer side. And I recognize that, hey, look, as much as I love my work, I want to capitalize on the upcoming wave and move over to the investor developer side. So looked for those opportunities and began discussing with Thor Equities. We actually started in the space in Spain, going back about 4 or 5 years ago with a project outside of Madrid. So when Thor was thinking about expanding their data center capabilities in the US, for me, it was a really interesting fit because they had experience. It wasn't a complete learning curve for them because of what had already been going on in Europe. They had a really good infrastructure team. So taking that industrial pedigree and asset management, development capabilities, acquisition capabilities that they had was something that I saw as a real opportunity to think, okay, look, we can build a platform here on a really good platform that already exists for developing other assets. So that's really what drew me here, was that combination of experience in the space, but also the ability to grow a platform program here in the US.
Interesting point about industrial real estate. That's one of the major, food groups within the broader real estate investment world. What are the advantages of having an industrial real estate team when starting a data center team? Are they kind of next door to each other as far as how the development looks?
Yeah, they are, if they've done the right things in the industrial space. If the only industrial work a group's ever done is just throw up warehouses and never have to acquire significant utilities or infrastructure, that's a further leap than having touched things in the, let's call them advanced manufacturing space or things that have touched heavy utilities. Then it starts to become a much closer marriage, really like the data center acquisition and development space is ultimately an infrastructure game, and knowing how to deal with municipalities, how to deal with the utilities, what questions ask when you're talking to utilities. A lot of our acquisitions folks have come over from historically industrials and made the leap pretty quickly. I'd say on the development side, we've been hiring folks more specifically with data center experience to help continue to bridge that gap. But there's a lot of core fundamentals there that are translatable, but there is still a need for data center expertise to bridge the gap in certain areas.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Madrid data center investment? It was the initial Thor Equities investment in data centers. It was in Spain. Why that area What does that say about the Thor Equities strategy, and what does it say about what's going to come next?
Madrid was interesting in that we as Thor kind of got into the data centers because we acquired a former Coca-Cola bottling facility in Madrid, realized that it had really strong utilities, and that led Joe Sitt and the Thor leadership team to really start to begin to explore the data center ecosystem and what it meant to develop a data center. And that led to us hiring some former executives out of ARC data centers and building a data center team in Europe. Madrid itself, I think, is an interesting cloud market because you'll see a lot of the major European countries essentially need a cloud zone inside of major urban areas because of data residency requirements, data localization requirements, etc. So part of the strategy there with Madrid was A, opportunistic in that we had a really good industrial site in a major city in Madrid, and B, part of a longer term plan for capitalizing on availability zone growth in those markets.
Let's move on to your experience at Google before we take a deeper dive into what you're going to do at Thor. What did you learn while you were at Google overseeing acquisitions for the Americas region?
One of the things I learned from my time at Google is we're just scratching the surface of what the world needs for compute capacity and the applications of compute capacity. We'll see evolutions of different product types, but I think there's going to be a lot of demand in a lot of different forms over the foreseeable future. For 10 years now, there's been a supply-demand mismatch. You can always kind of stay half a step ahead of it, but it was always kind of quick on your tails. But I would say in the last couple of years, right, that demand just blew past supply.
How does Google think about demand? What kinds of indications is it looking at?
They're really looking at the range of applications that are out there on the horizon, be they consumer, be they enterprise, be they robotics, right? Countless types of applications that data center demand is trying to fulfill through compute, through inference, through enterprise, cloud hosting. There's as many terabits needed as you can envision. A lot of that demand for all the big companies is really about capturing that level of compute market share. It's a snowball effect, right? The more you do out in the space, the more data you gather, that creates data, that creates compute, which then in turn creates more data to be computed. It's a snowball effect that as they are successful in gathering data and doing projects and doing programs and working with customers, it creates more and more compute requirements. And again, that would apply to anybody in the space, not just Google.
There is certainly a community engagement requirement when you are building data centers. At Google, you were lead for economic and community development. What does that mean, and what did you learn overseeing that function?
Yeah, that's actually a really cool job. It was really about, look, how do we show up as data center owners in a given community, in a given market? Everything from how do we engage with the local community? How do we message with the community and the state and local or even country level officials on Google's role in that environment, and data centers themselves, like representing the broader data center agenda, and a little bit of like, hey, trying to make sure people aren't scared about what data centers are, helping them understand what data centers are, and talk about all the good things that are happening. And there are good things that data centers do in the marketplace as well, right? Tax contributors, investing in the community, bringing valuable jobs, high skilled jobs in the community, bringing construction laborers and technical jobs in the community. So really making sure that those community leaders understood what it is we're doing and not let it be some black box up on a hill somewhere.
At Google, you developed a playbook for data center acquisition. What can you tell us about the importance of developing a playbook, and are you currently developing one for Thor?
Look, ultimately, a playbook is really just about having a process and a strategy by which you go to market, right? And thinking about those things like community engagement, thinking about those things like tax programs, development, engineering, etc. Data centers are more than just a real estate project. It's not just about acquiring a piece of land and doing some level of development that you might do for a residential or anything else. There is a whole host of community engagement activities, tax activities, infrastructure, engineering, construction. You play across all these spaces and you're jack of all trades in some cases when you do data center development. The playbook is ultimately making sure that the folks that are working on these projects with you are aware of what's required, all these steps, and how do you think about them in a sequential order.
How do you think about measuring demand for data center services? What are you looking at?
I look at it right now as a supply demand mismatch between grid energy capacity and compute energy capacity. It's a little bit difficult to put my finger on and say, hey, look, I know there's going to need to be 2 gigawatts, 5 gigawatts, 20 gigawatts of capacity. But what I do know is, good sites with grid capacity and a decent price point that have the tax programs, that have the infrastructure that you need, those are hard to come by. And those are always going to be in high demand. You don't want to necessarily try and time the market as much as focus on providing good, high quality product at good value. And compute needs are going to continue to grow because they're continuing to grow on top of themselves. So it's really ultimately about trying to find good product versus the trying to exactly peg the demand ultimately, right?
You are no doubt aware that there's been a lot of discussion lately in the data center world about, are we overbuilding capacity at the moment? Where do you sit on that conversation? Because on the one hand, one could say, oh, geez, perhaps the market is not properly measuring demand, and they're putting these 600 kW racks into these data centers, and no one needs that much compute. But on the other hand, at some point, the demand's going to catch up to it, and the owners of those assets might be happy that they have that much compute. But how do you think about that question of, are we overbuilding?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will go back to this idea of like good quality product versus just product, right?
If you could sort of imagine in the future what an underperforming data center might look like, what do you think would be some key characteristics of a data center that's not going to win, that perhaps is being built right now?
There's a lot of projects being pitched out there. It's funny. I just was reading an email today. It's like, hey, we've got 200 megawatts today. And you go, okay, wow, this is interesting. And you don't have to get more than like 2 minutes into reading more about it to figure out, oh, no, there's 200 megawatts on the line today, and the substation's still 24 months out. Zoning still has to be done. Other utilities still have to come to place, right? You've got folks that don't understand the dynamics of the supply chain and don't understand the dynamics of like what it's going to take to actually get that data center into place. Being near a major power line or near a major substation, even with some existing capacity, is not enough. There's a lot more that has to happen when you talk about zoning and supply chain and construction and build out. The other side of it is there's a lot of folks that think, oh, we've got this data center that was built 10, 20, 30 years ago. Let's take that and upscale it to an AI data center. Even to things like floor load is so dramatically different than it was 20, 30 years ago. Data centers that were built for 16 kW per rack floor load today be viable for the 600 kW per rack that NVIDIA's talking about. Those densities are so vastly different. Now, will they become underperforming data centers? Maybe not. There's a potential a use case for them, back-end logs type of thing, where you're just pure storage, non-market facing, but they'll have a very different use case and potentially value case going forward.
In the world of real estate, the food groups sometimes turn into each other. So you might have a 100-year-old factory that becomes a residential property. What do you think is going to happen to old data centers?
It is so hard to get power utilities of the scale that we're talking about. Let's use that same example, right? It is 16 kW per rack floor load or density load, and it's no longer deemed viable for that 600 kW per rack load. My guess would be it's going to be more efficient for you to go in and even knock that building down to take advantage of those utilities of the site rather than go build completely fresh from scratch, new, and pull utilities, etc.
I guess it's probably not that different from regular way real estate, where you just have to make a calculation on, is it more economical to tear this down and start from scratch, or to spend the money to refurbish it?
Yeah, I mean, 9 out of 10 times you look at a retrofit with data center, the bones themselves are not that useful. I mean, you would love to be able to reuse the existing building and facilities, but it's often really hard because of the floor loads, the roof loads, the utility routing inside of a building that goes on inside of a data center. Doing a retrofit is a really, really hard thing in the data center world, where cost-wise, you're often looking at the same cost for a retrofit versus a new build. It then just comes down to whether there's timing benefits. And
so I guess we're not going to be building apartments in data centers or starting a mall Um,
I mean, I would have said you've
uh,
never built an apartment in a church either, but you can go to go to New York and Chicago and see some pretty cool condos and apartments and some churches. So, never say never.
let me know when you build a data center in a church. That'll be interesting. Have you spent much time with the limited partners, the institutional investors behind Thor Equities? What kinds of questions do they have for you about what you're going to be doing for Thor Equities?
The LP side of the business was newer for me. At Google, we were our capital. So for me, learning the capital side of the business, have a lot of conversations with our LP partners. And for me, it's mainly giving them comfort that we know what we're doing, that we have a strategy. For them, I feel like there's a lot of education still happening in the space. There's a handful of investors that are super deep, that know the space inside and out. But there's a very large numbers of investors that are still trying to figure out how do we get in and how do we think about data centers? Because if they're typically real estate investors, data centers don't quite look and feel like a typical real estate deal. They're very adjacent in a lot of ways, but the risk profile is different. The capital allocations are different. How you even think about comps and exit values is dramatically different than typical real estate.
Excellent. Well, Raj Vohra, head of data center investing for the Americas for Thor Equities. Thank you so much for talking to Cool Vector today. I hope we can have you back in the future to let us know what's going on in this crazy market.
Awesome, David. Fun times. Yeah, I'm sure in a few months there'll be a whole new spin to it. So look forward to chatting again and appreciate the time.